Sure. My name is Scott Schaffner. I've been a history teacher in international schools and in New York City for over 20 years. I've done some school leadership as well. And before I was a history teacher, I was actually a lawyer in New York and in Florida. Yeah, I've always been interested in history. In my undergraduate university degree, bachelor degree was in history. Yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Okay. Now as for me, my name is Mark. I'm currently a ninth grader in Jakarta Intercultural School, obviously in Indonesia, Jakarta. My main interests are in probably history, humanities, social studies, politics, international relations, those areas. I'm really big into like MUN. Debate is a big thing as well. Public speaking and yeah, those subjects around in school. So with that out the way, I think we can start with the actual content, right? Which is the topic of this discussion is determining if we can make history discussions fun. So let's get into our first actual question. Okay. So history to many people is usually like a boring subject, right? So can we get your thoughts on why people can think it's a boring subject?
Well, I think a lot of students, and I'll include myself in that because I was a student, for many years, think of history as a boring topic because of the way it's taught. And I think a lot of times students have experienced a history class or a social studies or a social science class in a way where there's one person, the teacher, in the front of the room, and maybe they're speaking in a monotone voice, like I'm doing right now a little bit, and they're talking about names of famous people or historical figures and dates. And maybe they show a map, or but that they're in the front of the board. The students are sitting there. They're listening to this monotone voice about something that happened a long time ago, and they're asked to take notes because they know they'll be tested on names and dates and places and times. And that's pretty boring. And that's not really, students don't tend not to see why it matters to them. Why should I listen, or why should I care, or why should I be interested in this? Of course, they want to, get a good grade on the test or the assessment. So they'll try to study and give what the teacher wants. But when the teacher, I think when history class is taught that way, it's less engaging for students.
Mhm. I definitely agree. Like adding on, there's a lot of topics that people want to discuss in history, and the ones taught in school, the system that they put in place, where there's several units and you're going to be learning that unit for a long time,
Mhm.
essentially. I think that really lacks that certain aspect of like not maybe like I guess maybe continuity might be the word, as in the aspect that students want to learn more or students want to learn other things as opposed to one
Yep.
certain topic and one certain topic that's taught, especially taught too long, right? They
Yeah.
want to be learning something new or at least like analyzing a new topic rather than just sitting in a classroom listening to one person and like taking notes just because they know that they're gonna be having a test and they're gonna have to memorize dates,
I
wars, places, and people.
Right. And I think one of the keys to making it more interesting is for there to be less memorization, right? So it shouldn't be about, asking what questions or when questions. What I mean by that is to say on a test, what happened in 1776, or when did the World War One begin, or those types of questions. Those are kind of just rote memorization, right? The teacher
Yeah.
tells you, you read it in a book, and then you have to spit it back. I think when history is taught in a way when students are encouraged to ask, why did this happen, you know, or when did it happen? Those are very different thinking processes. To answer a question of why did something happen, you have to look at things a little bit like you said, like in a debate, right? On the one hand, there's this and this, but on the other hand, there might be this and this. I encourage when I teach history to say there is no black and white. There is no right or wrong answer. Now, that sounds weird to people sometimes because they think what happened in the past happened in the past. Those are facts, and we just need to know the facts of what happened. But I disagree with that significantly. I think um, none of us were alive and witnessed the events that we're studying in a book, right? So we only know what we know from what other people wrote about it or recorded. And when I say recorded, that can mean with a video camera and audio recording. And writing was also a way of recording things for thousands of years. And before that, it was oral history, right? So we're not actually studying what happened, but we're studying what people are telling us what happened. And so when you dive deeper into that, you realize that everybody has biases. Everybody's version of events of what happened is different. And when you can look at history that way, I think it becomes a little bit more interesting. I give you an example is when people, if you and a lot of experiments have shown this, if you had 10 people witness the same event, let's just say something as simple as a car accident, yeah, a red car and a blue car get into a car accident, and you ask 10 people exactly what happened, their stories are going to differ a little bit, you know.
Yeah.
Now, how and why that is an interesting study in human psychology and human beings. But just in that little example, you can see what happened as a fact is actually really subject to interpretation. It's subject to people's perspectives, their biases. And when you dive deep into history, you can see that that's a lot more than just telling me what year did this happen or who was the leader of Germany in this year. That's a very different way of approaching the discipline of history.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a really good point that you bring up. Like, especially also the importance, right? Because to a certain extent, figuring out why something happened, figuring out why a war happened is far more important than figuring out when it happened, what happened, right? Because there's also a really clear pattern right now, with since probably the Cold War as well, right? The Cold War was caused because of lots of tension, and still now there's a lot of tension, right? It's a very recurring thing, like the famous saying, right? History repeats itself.
Sure.
it's it's a really yeah, it's a really important thing that we figure out why and we analyze, rather than we're just like listing dates and um listing what happened, why I'm sorry, listing what happened, where, and when it happened, right?
Right. I agree. I think you're right. History repeats itself. I think the another or the similar quote is those who don't understand history are doomed to repeat it, right? So when
Yeah,
you say
yeah,
understanding history, it's less of the facts of the what and the when, and it's much more of the how and the why. I teach history in Central Europe right now, and the war in the Ukraine, like that. I think another aspect of understanding and making history engaging for students, they have to see how something that happened 100, 200 years ago actually impacts the world that they're in today. And
yeah,
if you can't make that link, of course it's going to be boring because this is something that maybe happened far away that has no impact on your life. And like students ask, who cares? Why do I need to know this? Why does this matter? But a teacher should have that part of his or her job is to make that clear and to understand that yes, this does impact your life, and let's look at that. And so I think that's really important. I think when you look at things like, we also tend to look at history, we paint a real brush of saying, well, there was good guys and there was bad guys, and that's a really, really dangerous and bad thing to do, I think, when you look at history, because we look at history through the glasses of hindsight. In other words, when we look at something that happened, we know how it ended. We know what the effects were. Yeah.
Yeah.
To be a person at that time and to make decisions that had to be made at the time, you can't put yourself truly have empathy and understand when you're talking, in the year 2023, right? So that's another thing to consider. I think when you look at, for instance, an easy example might be, the rise of Hitler. And of course, most people, they think of Hitler as an evil human being, right? For good reason. But what about the millions of German people who were not evil, but either went along or voted for Hitler or supported him either tacitly or implicitly or whatever it is? Like, how could that happen, right? Those weren't evil, not all of those people weren't evil, bad people. So the how that happened and the why it happened, a Great Depression, a fear of communism, political polarization, something that's very alive in the world today. You're either left or right. There's no room for coming to common ground and finding, diplomacy or debate or rational debate, less and less, unfortunately, maybe in some places, a lot of places. That's when you can see the patterns that do impact our life. And I think, for instance, MUN that you participate in, making history class more a little bit of a debate, right? To see that there's different sides and to have to take a side and be a German person in 1933, and why might Nazi ideals or domestic program economically appeal to you? It doesn't necessarily mean you supported genocide. It you have to have the context that that really digging a little deeper into history can give you.
Yeah, I think another good point, that's very, very similar to the one you just mentioned, is that history is written by the winners, right?
That's
We,
what they say.
yeah, like for example, we paint Hitler as a really bad guy, and I would also say he is a pretty bad guy for obvious reasons. But if for say, let's say like if Hitler won the war, it would have been completely different. He would
Well,
have been,
our understanding of everything, Mark, absolutely.
yeah,
Both of our lives, arguably every person on Earth's lives would be
yeah,
different
yeah,
today, right? And yeah, I mean, I think Winston Churchill had a great quote on that. I'm not gonna say it exactly as he said it, but he said history is gonna remember him really well. He said, because I'm gonna write it. So one of the first things Churchill did after he was elected out after the war was to write his version of his leadership during World War II. So
mhm,
of course it made him look like a superhero, right? Because he wrote the history. And
yeah,
and when you look at a lot of the history that we look at, right, they're written still. A lot of the textbooks are white men, white Western men, not all, and that's changing. And I think when we look back in 50 years from now at this time period, we'll see a significant shift in how history is recorded and written and looked at. Um, but that's another good example to say that history changes. Maybe not the names and the dates and the times, but how we look at history and how we consider it. I'll give you another example if you want to listen, if I'm not
yeah,
boring you yet.
sure,
But
sure, sure.
Woodrow Wilson, after World War One, Europe was ravaged, right? And
Yep.
they had a treaty in the 14 points, and that was going to, in these ideals of creating a League of Nations, the forerunner to the United Nations, of having an international body that would look out for people's individual rights, the nation states that, colonies, Africa and Asian places that had been, and I mean, really all over the world, South Central America, that people had a right to self-determination. These ideals were remarkable for the time, and a lot of people thought this was a chance to make life better for human beings on the planet, because it would be a marked difference than every generation going to war. So Wilson is considered, there's very few cities in Europe that don't have a Woodrow Wilson street or square or something to celebrate that. Woodrow Wilson and Churchill, who I mentioned earlier, by today's standards, were absolute racists. They saw that brown and dark-skinned people, non-white, non-Caucasian white men, were actually biologically inferior. They really believed that, right? And they were proponents of that race theory. So that's a remarkable difference. And there's lots of these differences in histories that you can say this guy was a hero, the great man theory of history, that great men make history. Um, but in reality, today we would say what a racist. At the time, people were welcoming him with open arms. So just an example, yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think that's a new perspective for me as well for World War II and everything.
Yeah, good.
Uh, so I think we've already covered that pretty well. Let's move on to the next question. So
Sure.
we've already discussed that history is pretty important, right? How important do you think history is, and do you think that it should be a priority in schools to teach?
I do. I think, there should be a basic level of understanding of history that every student should be exposed to, right? Obviously, as you get higher in your educational levels, you get to you should choose things that you're interested in and more passionate about. But
Yeah.
if you look at history as simply, maybe not simply, but if you look at history as understanding how and why things are today in the world that we live in, what could be more important than that, right? I mean, obviously health and science are, but it's certainly as, in my opinion, as important as anything else to try and make sense of anything. And we could play, you could throw anything at me and we could figure out, there's lots of problems in the world. We don't need to go into that. I think we all know that. And there always have been. But to understand how and why we got to this point, until you do that, solutions are much more difficult. Yeah. So I think, yeah, I think it's imperative that everybody understand to help make sense of why things are the way they are, the good and the bad.
Yeah, definitely. I think the thing that should be prioritized in history to make it like really important or to make students see it as important is, as we mentioned, looking for why, right? So how are we going to, but not only like why something happened, but how we're going to prevent it in the future, right? Like, because as I was
Sure.
saying, history repeats itself. How can we stop history from repeating itself? And I
Yeah.
think a really good way of looking at that is first we have to analyze the history itself, right? We have to analyze number one, how it happened, number two, why it happened, and number three, how we can prevent it from happening again, right? Because it's already repeating, and even though it's probably in everyone's heads that we shouldn't repeat probably like World War One, World War Two, it's not that easy to actually do, right? Like for example, Russia and the US, they have completely opposing ideologies in so many subjects, and it's really difficult. It's really difficult for them to get together and discuss a topic without actually fighting, right? As we can see in the war with Ukraine right now, there's so many proxy wars that they've joined, and just because Russia or the US is involved in that war, the opposing side has joined it just so they can beat the US or they can beat Russia. And I think what's really important is that we just look at that, we deeply analyze it, we see why it's happening, and in the future we will as students and as the future of this world, or as the future leaders of this world, sorry, I think it's really important if we just analyze it and we see how we can stop it. So how we can prevent it in the future again, right? What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that, you use the word analyze, and that's the key, right? Because
Yeah.
um, there is no, going back to something I said earlier, there is no black or white. There are no easy answers. I'm a Western white male, right? So I have my biases. I was born in the U.S. I've lived in Europe for a long time now. So I have a Western with a capital W, bias, whether I like it or I realize it or not, when I look at things. Um, And I hate what I see right now with the war in the Ukraine, but at the same time, I try to look at the Russian perspective, right? And I try to understand. I don't think all Russians are bad people. I hope nobody thinks that way, right? So
Yeah, yeah,
how is it that Russian people could support something like this? That's an example of a really important question when we look at future conflicts, right? Like how does this idea start? Where does it, we talk about in history the causes of things, right? But there's long term, there's short term. Of course, there's always social, there's political. Economics is a huge impact we know in today's world. I
yeah,
think we tend to paint over sometimes some of the successes that the world has had. When you look at some of the things that an organization like the United Nations has done, um, I think there's a lot of good that has happened in the world, and the media does tend to dominate with the negative in the world. But I think there's millions of people in the world with a better life because we have learned from the past to some extent. Yeah. So
yeah,
I think trying to be balanced and trying to look at different perspectives is the key, because without having real empathy and being able to sit down and have that discussion, which we're not going to see. I don't think we're going to see anytime soon. The European Union or the leaders of the United States or NATO sit down with Putin or his close advisors. You know, why isn't that ever going to happen? Right? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they will. But
yeah.
just the fact that these human beings can't come together to try and empathize with each other and understand and come to an agreement, that's concerning, right? So there's deep reasons for that. I would argue, Mark, that in this example we're talking about, that the Cold War, most people think, oh, the Cold War ended when the Soviet Union fell in 1989, 91. Um, I would argue it never ended. I think we are still in a Cold War of an ideology, of different ideologies between the West and a Russian Orthodox kind of historical view on things, and that's part of understanding where we are, because things that have went on even when the Russian Revolution before that, 1917. So there's direct links to understanding things that are over 100 years old, right? That people are taught, this is why we shouldn't trust the West. This is why we shouldn't trust the United States or France or Great Britain. And maybe some of those reasons are legitimate.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we should move on now. I think, if I'm not wrong, it's been over 15 minutes, but
You're
I think
probably
we, yeah, I think we did already answer the question, which is determining if we can make history discussions fun.
right.
And
Uh-huh.
primarily, the answer is yes. Correct me if I'm wrong, but um, I think from what I got from this this discussion is that yes, it can be fun, and yes, it's an important subject. We just have to be answering the right questions instead of focusing primarily on like questions like what, when, where. We should be prioritizing how and why, right?
Yeah. I think that's a really good starting point, because that can go deep just in itself, right?
Yeah.
When you look at things as a debate, different perspectives, tie it to modern day, I think that makes it more engaging and it helps students understand why this is important.
Okay. Okay, I think that's a good conclusion. I think we can move on to the Q&As now.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, well, as a teacher, while we're waiting for the other audience participants to ask their questions, I wanted to ask Mr. Scott. So oftentimes we teach a concept for the entire semester. Okay, let's say colonization of India, and we teach it for the entire semester, and we try to make it fun and include various projects and etc. But a lot of the times what I struggle with is that my students get bored. You know, it's a whole semester, and this is what I'm prescribed to do. So what's the pace? How can I make this better for my students? What's the proper pace of teaching history to make it engaging and not get my students, you know, not have them get bored because I'm taking a full semester to teach it? Do you have any tips for that?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question because I think you used the word prescribed, right? So teachers have to get students through a certain amount of content or subject matter, like the names, the dates, the events. So, for instance, you just said, what was the one you used? It was the colonization of.
Colonization of India, yeah.
So, you know, that's a pretty clear kind of like Mark and I were talking about in the video, like when did this happen? What are the dates? Who are the key players? Approach, right? So I think you can still cover the same content, but you can take a different approach. And one of the things you can do is rather than just content based, it's more thematic. So in other words, when you look at the British colonization of India, sure, there's some things that you need to know who the players were, you know, the scope of when and where and things like that. But I think it comes alive more to students and is more interesting to teach as well if you use more of a thematic approach to say, okay, so here are the things that we saw or that happened in the colonization of India by the British Empire. And where else did those same themes happen, right? And why is it that colonization, be it in India, be it by the Spanish in South and Central America, maybe the French in Canada or in Africa or in Southeast Asia, like there's patterns there. And there's things thematically that you could look at that make sense and help students understand more. And I think that can help with the pacing you said, but also student interest and engagement. I think an example would be to maybe spend half the time on the actual colonization of India and then let students choose another instance of colonization and to dive into that, and for them to have the agency to pick something that they're interested in, maybe due to personal family reasons or just in general, and to apply some of those same concepts to one content area into others. And I think that helps students also make connections to the bigger pictures, and I think that's important.
Thank you so much. That's very, very helpful.
Sure.
And I think, Mrs. Scott, we have another question by one of the members of the audience. I'll read it aloud. What do you think if I say all the subjects are history? Because we just learn history of science or mathematics, as we don't learn, or as we don't do anything new.
Could you say it again, maybe just a little bit? I'm not sure I understand the question.
So the question is, what do you think if I say all subjects are history? Because we just learn history of science or mathematics, as we don't do anything new. Any comments on it?
So yeah, I mean, that's an excellent point. I think that's something for a history teacher. I think a good history teacher can look at anything and be able to explain some of the history and again some of the same themes of causation, why things change and how they change, and why some things don't, why some things will continue, where human beings still do same thing, some of the same things they've done 10,000 years ago. And that can be in any field, right? Any discipline. So even something like design, if you take design class or a STEM and something engineering and how that has evolved and how human beings have built on previous ideas and how and why that changed, I think is a great way to teach. Is that addressing the question? Is that kind of what the question's asking?
Yeah, I think that's good. We have another question by the audience. I'll read it aloud again. How can one analyze a war when the narrative is often written by the winner's side?
Great question. Well, analyzing is a word that I think a lot of people maybe don't fully understand, or maybe they think they have an idea of what it means. But I think when you analyze, it's important to dig deep. So while history is written by the winners, we have at our fingertips now, quite literally, the most access to information that we ever have. So I think the idea that other schools of thought of history are readily available. So that might not only mean by the winners, and even the winners will disagree over a lot of things, right? Different schools of thought, people who look at history, when archives open, that's sometimes a very whole different thing. I mean, right now, today, as we're talking, a new king is being coronated in Great Britain. Pretty historical for all kinds of reasons. But one of the things the most important thing I find interesting is that the new king is going to be willing to open up the archives, which have not been of the royal family, right? So what is in that paperwork from hundreds and hundreds of years ago that has never been shared before? Maybe about the slave trade, maybe about colonization and all of those things. So our understanding of history keeps evolving, and I think even if the history was written by the winners, having a modern perspective to look back on it and to be able to analyze different causes or different factors, you can always still be able to do that and have a new twist or your own idea. And I think one of the things that's important is to look at it as a historian. Historians, like who are professional historians, they learn the same things we do. The reason they become successful, not necessarily economically, but also just in terms of having a good reputation as a good historian, is by challenging old assumptions, by looking at things in a new light and saying, well, what about this, or what about that hasn't been written about much? And there's always ways to do that if you're willing to roll up your sleeves a little bit and look below the surface.
If no one has any more questions, I'll ask my question that we weren't able to fit in the 15-minute time span of the actual interview. So, basically, uh, most of the people I know, especially Asian students, are more interested as a career choice in something like a business or economy, just because it's generally makes more money. Why should they also be interested in history?
Well, I think I don't know if that's accurate. I think there's an assumption, and there's one thing historians and people who study history aren't good at is promoting themselves. Yeah, like it's not always sold and marketed or looked at as an exciting thing. Governments want to control history. If you think about it, every person who's listening to this and everybody around the world, their history class is different, pretty much. Yeah. In other words, wherever you live, even if you take the IB program, there's different parts of history to study that the teacher selects. Yeah. But in more traditional schools where people can't afford or have the opportunity to go to a private or international school, governments, choose what history gets learned. And so they want you to look at their country and their heroes certain ways. And so there's also governments are more invested in promoting, and quite literally promoting, putting money in and trying to open universities for math and science, because that's equated with innovation, with trying to improve things and trying to economically, socially improve the world, which isn't necessarily untrue. But my question would be that, and I've actually asked this of some
people who are leaders of companies in biotechnology or internet technology and all of the kind of things I think, Mark, you're talking about, where people assume that's going to equal success in your future, is if somebody who takes history is taught to really be able to think critically and look at different factors and make an argument and try and problem solve, right? We know that these things happened in the past. Now we have another problem before us. How can we apply what we know and try to make the best informed decisions? Every single leader of a company and organization wants somebody who can think that way. That's a fact. When you look at, for instance, as a teacher, I sometimes have to sell it. Like, why should you take history when there's psychology, there's economics, there's business, right? You can't take all of them. So why history? When you look at the World Economic Forum, they gather every year in Davos, and these are the world leaders in politics, economics, nonprofits. You've heard of Davos, Mark? You know what I mean? You can Google it, right? But it's kind of the world leaders get together to try and figure out, the future of the world, which way, how can we make the world better? The United Nations participates, but they come out every year or periodically, I shouldn't say, but they talk a lot about education and what do the jobs of the future need. And their number one skill, right? And this is approaching history another way too, looking at the skills it teaches you. The number one thing is that businesses want creative thinkers and analytical thinkers. And if history can be taught in a way where you can be creative in terms of looking at something differently, analyzing factors that maybe others have not, that's what they want, right? That's exactly the type of skill that they want tomorrow's leaders and tomorrow's company CEOs to be able to do, right? And so history can do that if it's taught the right way.
There's another question. Is it possible to rectify inaccurate or biased historical narratives? If so, how? What are the examples on this?
Is it possible to rectify, or what was the word used?
Oh, yeah. Is it possible to rectify inaccurate or biased historical narratives? If so, how? What are the examples on this?
Well, I think there's a lot. I think examples come out all the time. I mean, almost nonstop. And so when we talk about historical narratives, that's kind of the what happened, the when, and all the rest of it. And also, then you get to the analytical and the historian, the human being saying, here are the causes, or here are the things that mattered most. And that's the skill of being analytical and being able to critically realize what is being written about, like what is being used as narrative that's actually somebody's opinion. In the age of fake news, where anything can be not true depending on your perspective, this skill is more important than any. So examples that historical narratives, I think there's so many. I think a simple one, I guess, if that simple might not be the right word, but again, today with reading the news and looking at the coronation of the King of England, and why I find it interesting I know why it's such a big deal, but I'm still fascinated at how it's such a big deal in some ways, if that makes any sense. I think, when you look at colonization, going back to some of the things we discussed, that narrative was for many, many years, the white Europeans bringing a better quality of life, civilization, roads, schools, hospitals, technological advancement to countries that didn't have it. And I think that narrative has been significantly updated and revised significantly. And is there a little bit of truth to that old narrative? Sure. But there's certainly voices now, and there's enough that students today will read, and the next generation will read even maybe more so, that give a very different narrative of not necessarily the what happened, but how and why as well.
And I think we can take one final question from the audience. There's a question already. There is a lot of misinformation in the world that we know of as of today. Was this was always the case, and the history is more about perspective one has led and information one is exposed to. Sorry, could the person like repeat that? But we have another question. Actually, we'll just read that one first. As a historian, how do you see the future with AI in our lives? Is it going to be a boon, or are we doomed?
I tend to not take the pessimistic view. I think when you look throughout history, when the calculator was there was a huge debate years ago about should calculators be allowed in school or not, when laptops and should they be allowed to be used. And I think all of these technological advancements, going back to the abacus, the slide rule, if you've ever heard of a slide rule, and I'm just using math as one example, all of these things create fear and uncertainty when they first come out because they're new, and we tend to, I think, as humans, we want to protect each other's and ourselves, and we always want to be aware of the negative, bad things that it could do, and it's not to say that there aren't negative or bad things that could happen, but I think we would be putting our heads in the sand to not look at this technology that exists and look at ways that we can use it for all the positives and all of the good things. At the same time, being aware of and explaining that, AI, for instance, is only as accurate and objective as the person inputting the data. So if that person, as every human being, has bias and has a lack of objectivity or all the rest of it, then, again, critical thinking and not just assuming what AI or a robot or a machine tells you is truth, right? Being able to weigh those things and think analytically and realize that it's not always that easy or black and white, I think is important. And going back to what I think that other question was hinting about was, human beings forever have been trying to influence the way others think and look and act, and that's always gone on. And the use of propaganda, which is, to influence somebody's opinion, that's been around as long as people have been around and always will be. So I think it's all related in that if you have the skills to say, okay, that's one person or one chatbot's opinion or view, but I also know that there has to be other things out there, and to be able to be critical and analytical about that is there's no reason to think it's the end of the world. I've already lived through, I remember, not that long ago, but in 1999, the end of the world was going to happen when 2000 hit. If you're interested in learning about that, everybody thought that when the New Year's hit 2000, computers, and they weren't coded to have that year, so everything would stop and there would be chaos, and there was a lot of worry about that. Nothing ever happened.
Okay, thank you for the question, and I think you have one final question. There's a lot of misinformation in the world that we know as of today. Was this always the case? And the history is more about one perspective. So I think I can try to summarize this. So was it always the case that history has been presented in one perspective? One piece of, or like pieces of information that a person is exposed to?
Hard to say. I mean, like I would say anybody studying history particularly is to avoid terms like always, right? Because there's going to be exceptions. It's impossible to paint such a broad picture, but certainly I think as civilization, as humans have evolved, we look at, civilizations, people, nations, people who speak the same language, have the same maybe, ancestry, ethnic similarities, right? Who come together as a nation. They need to, and I hesitate to use the manipulate, but I think it's fair, history, because people need things to rally around. They need, every country, I think, if you look at it, every nation has heroes. It has symbols of that evoke pride. The flag is an example, right? So it helped when the people who were in power, and again, when you go back years when it was less of average people having the power, and it was the very small percentage of people with the political power, economic power, they wanted to maintain their power, and knowledge is power. And so their versions of history and what was happening and why things were happening, that was the only truth that could be taught. And we still see that in the world today. There's certain places where only one version of the truth or an explanation of why things are the way they are is acceptable, and you can be punished if you veer from that, right? If you don't follow that. That's still very much alive and has been going on, I think, as long as people have been around.
Okay, so I think we've answered enough questions. There's no more questions from the audience, and I personally don't have any more questions. So I think we can end it here, yeah?
Thank you very much, Mark. It's been fun talking with you.
Thank you. And I'd just like to note again, thank you for everyone who joined. And thank you for staying this far in the webinar.